Is everyone all right? What just happened here?
Odessa, explain yourself. What have you done?
Mom, stop. I think she just saved me. If you're watching this, I'd love to get to know you. Please comment your location and the time below. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for being here today.
Odessa Marchand knelt on a marble ballroom floor in a plain black and white waitress uniform, pulling 3 small, sharp pins out of the polished stone just seconds before her own sister's ankle would have come down directly on top of them, mid-spin, in front of 200 of Atlanta's wealthiest guests. She'd noticed the glint of metal from clear across the room. She hadn't stopped to think. She'd simply moved, faster than anyone watching could quite track, dropping to her knees in her serving uniform to clear the floor a half-second before disaster. Julian Ashford Cole, the billionaire's son the entire evening had been built around impressing, reached her sister at almost the exact same instant, both of them arriving to steady Vanessa as she stumbled, all 3 of them colliding into a single, tangled moment on that dance floor while 200 guests gasped. For one suspended second, nobody in that ballroom moved.
What just happened here?
Then Odessa's own mother stepped forward, pointed a manicured finger directly at her, and said loud enough for the entire room to hear, "I don't know this woman. Get her away from my daughter." Her sister, straightening her dress, breathless from the near fall Odessa had just prevented, wouldn't even meet her eyes. "I don't know her either." Julian Cole, still holding Vanessa's arm, absorbed that denial without questioning it for even a moment, turned to his own security detail, and gave an order that would haunt him for months to come. "Get her out of here." Odessa Marchand was dragged out of that ballroom in her waitress uniform, past 200 watching guests, past the sister she'd just saved from serious injury, past the mother who'd raised her, both of them denying, in front of an entire room, that they had ever known her at all. What none of them understood that night, not her mother, not her sister, not even Julian Cole himself, was that Odessa was the entire reason any of them had an invitation to that party in the first place. And it would take him considerably longer than he ever expected to understand exactly what he'd thrown away the moment he gave that order. Before I tell you exactly how this story actually ends, if this is your first time here, go ahead and hit subscribe, because I promise you this one is worth staying for all the way through. Like this video if you're already furious on Odessa's behalf, share it with somebody who's ever given everything to a family that never gave it back, and drop a comment below with the time and the city you're watching this from. I read every single one, and I love seeing exactly how far these stories travel. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to understand exactly who Odessa Marchand really was, and exactly how she ended up serving drinks at the party her own family had no idea she'd made possible. Denise Marchand raised 2 daughters in Atlanta, Georgia, under a value system so lopsided that even close family friends had noticed it for years without ever quite saying so directly to her face. Vanessa, the younger of the 2 by 4 years, had been, since childhood, the daughter Denise built her entire sense of pride around. Strikingly beautiful, effortlessly charming in social settings, the kind of daughter Denise loved to introduce at church functions and family gatherings, always with a specific, possessive pride in her voice. Vanessa had never held a steady job in her adult life, drifting between beauty school she never finished and a string of short-lived retail positions, supported financially, almost entirely, by a combination of Denise's own modest savings and whatever Vanessa could charm out of the men she dated. Odessa, for years older, had grown up in the shadow of that specific, lopsided favoritism, understanding from an early age that her own worth, in her mother's eyes, would never be measured the same generous way Vanessa's was. Odessa wasn't unattractive, not by any reasonable standard, but she lacked Vanessa's effortless, showy beauty, and Denise had made that comparison clear to her, in ways large and small, for the entirety of Odessa's childhood. What Odessa possessed instead was a work ethic that had carried her, entirely on her own, through community college and into a steady career with Ashford Event Collective, one of Atlanta's most respected luxury event planning and staffing agencies. Work she'd built over 6 disciplined years into genuine expertise, coordinating and staffing some of the city's most exclusive private gatherings. Denise rarely asked about that career in any real detail. To Denise, Odessa did event work, a phrase delivered with the same dismissive vagueness she might have used for any job she considered beneath serious family conversation. The contrast between how Denise treated her two daughters extended into nearly every corner of their shared history. Odessa remembered, with a clarity that had never fully faded, her own high school graduation, where she'd earned a partial academic scholarship to community college through genuinely difficult, sustained effort, an achievement her mother had acknowledged with a brief, distracted congratulations before spending the remainder of that same dinner discussing, at considerable length, Vanessa's upcoming middle school pageant. Odessa had learned, from that evening and dozens like it throughout her childhood, exactly how her own accomplishments would typically be received in comparison to anything involving her sister's beauty or social charm. She'd stopped expecting different treatment sometime in her early 20s, a resignation that wasn't quite the same as genuine peace, but that had allowed her, at least, to stop the exhausting cycle of hoping for a recognition that rarely arrived. She poured that redirected energy instead into her career, finding in her professional accomplishments a source of genuine pride that didn't depend on her mother's inconsistent attention to validate it. The party at the center of this story was, in Denise's mind, the single most important social opportunity of Vanessa's entire adult life, an engagement gala hosted by the Cole family, one of the wealthiest and most socially prominent families in Atlanta, celebrating the launch of a new charitable foundation spearheaded by their only son, Julian Ashford Cole, a 32-year-old investor who had, over the preceding several years, become one of the city's most talked about, most eligible bachelors. Denise had spent weeks maneuvering for an invitation to that exact gala, calling in every social connection she could manage, convinced that if Vanessa could simply be in the same room as Julian Cole, her daughter's natural beauty and charm would do the rest of the work required to secure the kind of life-changing match Denise had been quietly engineering for years. What Denise never discovered, what she had no idea about throughout the entire frantic process of securing that invitation, was that the connection that actually made it possible had nothing to do with her own social maneuvering at all. Odessa's staffing agency, Ashford Event Collective, held the exclusive contract for the Cole family's private events, and it was Odessa herself, working directly with the Cole family's own event coordinator, who had processed the final guest list for that evening, including, at Denise's persistent, unknowing request through a mutual family friend, 2 additional names Denise had specifically pushed to have added, her own, and Vanessa's. Odessa added her mother and sister to that guest list without ever mentioning it to either of them, understanding, from years of quietly absorbing her family's dismissiveness, that revealing her own role in securing their invitation would likely earn her nothing more than the same casual indifference she'd grown used to receiving for every other quiet contribution she made to her family's life. Odessa arrived at the Cole estate the afternoon before the gala, exactly as she had for dozens of the family's previous events, overseeing the final logistics of an evening she'd spent 3 full weeks meticulously planning: vendor coordination, staff scheduling, the specific, exacting details that made the difference between a merely successful society event and the kind of flawless evening the Cole family had come to expect from Ashford Event Collective. She dressed, as she always did while actively working an event, in her staffing agency's simple, professional uniform. A plain black dress with a white apron, functional and unremarkable, designed specifically to let her move efficiently through a crowded ballroom without drawing attention away from the guests she was there to serve. Denise and Vanessa arrived that evening dressed in the kind of careful, expensive formal wear Denise had spent considerable money securing for exactly this occasion, moving through the Cole estate's grand entrance with the specific, anticipatory excitement of 2 people convinced this single evening might change the entire trajectory of their lives. Neither of them noticed Odessa initially, moving efficiently among the catering staff near the ballroom's edge, her attention focused entirely on the evening's careful choreography, rather than on locating her own family within the crowd. She'd made a private, resigned peace, walking into that evening, with the likelihood that her mother and sister would move through the entire gala without ever fully registering her presence, an assumption that would prove, within the following hours, considerably more painfully accurate than even Odessa herself had anticipated. The moment that would define the rest of that evening happened almost by accident, roughly an hour into the gala, as Odessa moved quickly through a crowded section of the ballroom carrying a tray of champagne. Her attention split between the tray itself, and a logistical question one of her junior staff members had just radioed through her earpiece. She turned a corner near the room's center at the exact moment Julian Cole stepped backward from a conversation. The collision unavoidable, a full glass of champagne splashing directly across the front of his tailored charcoal suit. "I am so sorry," Odessa said immediately, already reaching for a cloth from her apron, mortified in the specific, professional way any staff member dreads an incident exactly like this one at an event this significant. Julian looked down at his ruined suit, then back up at Odessa, and did something she genuinely hadn't expected. He laughed, a warm, unguarded laugh that immediately diffused the tension of the moment. "Well, I suppose this means I finally have an excuse to change out of this jacket. It's been strangling me all evening anyway. Let me get you something to properly clean that," Odessa said, still mortified despite his easy graciousness, guiding him gently toward a quieter alcove near the ballroom's edge where she could work on the stain without further disrupting the evening's flow. They talked while she worked for nearly 10 minutes. An easy, genuine conversation that had nothing to do with the gala's careful social choreography, and everything to do with two people who found, almost immediately, an unexpected comfort in each other's company. Julian asked about her work. Odessa found herself, uncharacteristically, actually answering honestly, describing the meticulous planning behind the evening he was currently hosting, an answer that seemed to genuinely fascinate him rather than bore him the way she'd half expected. "You built all of this?" Julian asked, gesturing toward the elegant, carefully orchestrated ballroom around them. "With a team, but yes. Most of it," Odessa admitted. "It shows," Julian said simply. "It's the best event my family has hosted in years." Denise, watching from across the ballroom, had spent the preceding hour growing increasingly anxious about exactly how to engineer a meaningful introduction between Vanessa and Julian, an anxiety that intensified considerably once the evening's entertainment shifted toward an open dance floor, the specific moment Denise had been counting on to showcase Vanessa's one genuinely reliable social asset. What Denise hadn't accounted for, in all her careful planning, was that Vanessa, despite her natural beauty and easy social charm, had never actually learned to dance with any real skill, a gap in her daughter's otherwise carefully cultivated social presentation that became suddenly, urgently relevant the moment Julian Cole's own event coordinator announced the evening's formal dance segment, specifically designed to let Julian personally engage with several of the evening's most prominent guests. Vanessa was approached within the segment's first few minutes by Julian's coordinator, extending an invitation for her to join him for the evening's opening dance, an opportunity Denise had specifically, desperately been hoping for, and one that now threatened to become a genuine catastrophe given Vanessa's complete lack of actual dancing ability. "Mom, I can't," Vanessa whispered urgently, panic entering her voice for the first time all evening. "I don't know how to do this. I'll embarrass myself in front of everyone." Denise, scanning the room with a rising desperation, spotted Odessa near the ballroom's edge, still finishing her conversation with Julian, and made a decision in that exact moment that revealed, more clearly than almost anything else in this entire story, exactly how her family's dynamic actually functioned. Denise crossed the ballroom quickly, pulling Odessa aside with an urgency that Odessa hadn't seen from her mother in years, an urgency that, for one brief, foolish moment, Odessa almost mistook for genuine maternal concern before understanding exactly what her mother actually wanted. "Odessa, please, you have to help your sister," Denise said, her voice carrying a pleading quality entirely unfamiliar coming from a woman who rarely asked her older daughter for anything at all. "Vanessa doesn't know how to dance, and Julian's coordinator just asked her to be his opening partner. You know how to dance, baby, you always did, please. Just teach her something quick, anything, before this ruins everything." Odessa stood there for a long moment, absorbing the specific, painful irony of her own mother finally seeking her out at this party, not out of any genuine interest in her daughter's presence, but purely out of a desperate need for the one skill Odessa happened to possess that might rescue Vanessa's moment. She could have said no. Some quiet, long-buried part of her genuinely considered it, standing there in her staff uniform, watching her mother's desperate, pleading expression. But Odessa had spent her entire life wanting, more than almost anything else, to finally feel like a genuine, valued part of her own family, and some part of her, Even now, even after years of consistent disappointment, still hoped that helping in this exact moment might finally, somehow, earn her that place. Okay, Odessa said quietly. Get her to the back hallway. I'll teach her what I can in the time we have. Odessa spent nearly 15 frantic minutes in a quiet service hallway behind the ballroom, working with a focus and patience that reflected years of her own quiet discipline, teaching Vanessa a simplified sequence of steps built around a classic waltz frame, choosing choreography specifically designed to look elegant and impressive while requiring the absolute minimum of Vanessa's actual, limited coordination. Follow my lead exactly, Odessa said, guiding her sister through the sequence for perhaps the 8th time, adjusting Vanessa's posture, her hand placement, the specific timing of each turn. Julian will be leading, so most of what you need to do is simply trust his lead and hit these specific marks when he guides you into them. You can do this, Vanessa. You just need to trust the steps. Vanessa, to her credit, absorbed the choreography with more genuine effort than Odessa had necessarily expected. Driven by her own considerable fear of public humiliation, practicing the sequence over and over in that narrow hallway until the steps began gradually to feel less foreign in her body. Thank you, Vanessa said, in a rare, genuine moment as they finished, something in her voice suggesting, for just a moment, an actual awareness of exactly what her sister had just done for her. I mean it, Odessa. I don't know what I would have done without you right now. I know, Odessa said simply, smoothing her own apron back into place, already mentally returning to the dozens of logistical details still requiring her attention for the remainder of the evening. Go. You'll do beautifully. She had no idea, watching her sister hurry back toward the ballroom, exactly how directly connected that hallway lesson was about to become to everything that unfolded over the following 20 minutes. Vanessa's dance with Julian Cole began, to Denise's evident relief, considerably better than her earlier panic had suggested it might. Julian, an experienced, confident lead, guided her smoothly through the sequence Odessa had just taught her. Vanessa's natural beauty and the elegant simplicity of Odessa's chosen choreography combining to create exactly the impressive visual moment Denise had been hoping for throughout the entire evening. Julian found himself, watching Vanessa move with unexpected grace through their dance, genuinely charmed by what appeared to be natural talent, entirely unaware of the frantic 15-minute lesson that had actually produced the polished performance currently unfolding in front of 200 watching guests. What none of them could see, positioned near the edge of the ballroom floor, largely obscured by the crowd's angle, was a small scattering of decorative pins that had fallen, unnoticed, from an elaborate floral display positioned too close to the dance floor's edge. Pins now resting directly in the path of Vanessa's next turn. Odessa, watching from near the catering station, her professional eye trained through years of experience to notice exactly this kind of subtle, potentially dangerous detail, spotted the glint of metal on the marble floor at nearly the same instant Vanessa began her turn directly toward it. She moved without conscious thought, crossing the distance between herself and the dance floor faster than she'd have believed herself capable of, dropping to her knees in her formal serving uniform directly in Vanessa's path, sweeping the pins clear with her bare hand a fraction of a second before her sister's foot would have come down directly on top of them. Vanessa, startled by Odessa's sudden appearance directly in her path, stumbled mid-turn, her balance faltering in a way that had nothing to do with her actual dancing ability, and everything to do with the sudden, unexpected obstacle now kneeling on the floor in front of her. Julian, reacting with the same quick instinct that had made him genuinely likable throughout the entire evening, moved immediately to steady her, reaching for Vanessa's arm at almost the exact same moment Odessa rose from the floor to help stabilize her sister from the other side. The three of them collided into a brief, tangled moment at the center of that dance floor, Julian's hand accidentally catching Odessa's shoulder as he worked to keep Vanessa upright. All three of them frozen, for one suspended second, in front of 200 guests who had no context whatsoever for what they were actually witnessing. The music continued for a few more disoriented beats before the small orchestra, sensing the disruption, allowed the song to trail into silence, leaving that entire tangled moment exposed in the ballroom's sudden, uncomfortable quiet. Julian looked between the two women, genuine confusion crossing his face, clearly trying to piece together exactly what had just happened. exactly who this waitress was who had apparently just prevented some kind of accident on his own dance floor. "Is everyone all right?" Julian asked, his voice carrying across the now silent room. "What just happened here?"
Is everyone all right? What just happened here?
Denise reached the center of that dance floor within seconds, her expression carrying none of the desperate warmth she'd shown Odessa in that back hallway only 20 minutes earlier, replaced instead by a sharp, immediate concern about exactly how this entire scene might reflect on her family's carefully cultivated image in front of Atlanta's most prominent social circle. "What is going on here?" Denise demanded, her eyes moving quickly between her disheveled daughter and the waitress still crouched partially on the floor. "Vanessa, are you hurt?" Before Vanessa could fully answer, Julian turned toward Odessa directly, his own confusion still evident. This young woman just prevented what looked like it could have been a serious fall. "Does anyone know her?" Denise's response arrived within a single, devastating second, delivered with a cold, immediate certainty that would haunt every single person present for considerably longer than the party itself. "I don't know this woman," Denise said, pointing a manicured finger directly at Odessa. "Get her away from my daughter." Odessa stood there, still catching her breath from the sudden physical exertion, absorbing her own mother's denial with a specific, familiar devastation that somehow still managed to cut deeper than every previous instance of dismissal she'd endured throughout her entire life. She looked to Vanessa, some small, foolish part of her still hoping, even after everything, that her sister might correct their mother, might acknowledge, in front of this crowd, exactly who had just taught her to dance and exactly who had just kept her from falling. Vanessa, straightening her dress, refused to meet Odessa's eyes. "I don't know her either." Julian Cole stood at the center of that ballroom, processing the sudden, jarring denial from two women who moments earlier had seemed entirely unremarkable guests among the evening's larger crowd, now watching them disown, with cold and immediate certainty, a woman who had apparently just prevented some kind of accident on his own dance floor. What Julian didn't understand, standing in that exact moment, was the full context Odessa herself couldn't easily explain in the sudden, public confusion of the moment. That these two women denying any knowledge of her were, in fact, her own mother and sister. That she'd spent the last 20 minutes personally teaching Vanessa the exact dance sequence currently earning Julian's admiration. That she was, in the broadest sense, the entire reason this specific ballroom existed in its current, flawlessly executed form. Julian, working from an incomplete, confusing picture, and perhaps influenced more than he'd later be comfortable admitting by simple social deference to the two guests actively vouching for their own account of events, made a decision in that moment that he would spend considerable time regretting. "Get her out of here," Julian said, turning to the security personnel stationed near the ballroom's edge, his voice carrying an authority that immediately set several members of his security detail into motion. Odessa didn't resist as two security guards took hold of her arms, guiding her firmly toward the ballroom's side exit. Her staff uniform suddenly, painfully conspicuous among 200 formally dressed guests, all of them watching this entire scene unfold with a mixture of discomfort and morbid curiosity. She didn't cry until she was fully outside, standing alone in the estate service parking area, the cold Atlanta evening air replacing the warm, elegant ballroom she'd spent 3 exhausting weeks building for people who had just publicly denied ever knowing her at all. Odessa drove home that night in a silence considerably heavier than any exhaustion she'd previously experienced after even the most demanding professional events, processing not simply the humiliation of being physically removed from a party, but the far deeper, more painful confirmation of exactly how little her own family valued her, even after everything she'd quietly given them, both that specific evening and across her entire adult life. She thought, driving through empty Atlanta streets well past midnight, about the invitation she'd quietly secured for her mother and sister, an act of generosity neither of them would ever know about, let alone appreciate, given everything that had just happened. She thought about the 15 minutes in that back hallway, teaching Vanessa exactly the skill that had earned her that dance with Julian Cole in the first place. She thought about her own instinctive dive toward those pins, an act that had cost her nothing but a few scraped knees and had very likely prevented a genuinely serious injury to the sister, who'd just denied knowing her in front of 200 people. She made a decision, sometime during that quiet, painful drive home, that would define the following 2 years of her life. She was done. Not simply done with that particular evening, but done entirely, with continuing to pour herself into a family relationship that had demonstrated, repeatedly and now undeniably, exactly how little genuine value it held for her. She submitted her formal resignation from Ashford Event Collective 3 weeks later, not because of any dissatisfaction with the work itself, but because she'd decided, in the aftermath of that devastating evening, that it was finally time to build something entirely her own, something no one could ever again deny knowing simply because acknowledging her had become socially inconvenient. Odessa used the considerable expertise she'd built over 6 years at Ashford Event Collective to launch her own boutique event planning company, Marchand Events, starting the business from a small home office with 3 initial clients she'd cultivated carefully during her final months at her previous position. The work was exhausting in an entirely different way than her previous employment had been, carrying now the full weight of building a business rather than simply executing someone else's established operation. But Odessa found, in that exhausting independence, a specific kind of satisfaction she'd never quite experienced working for someone else's company. Her business grew steadily over the following 18 months. Her reputation for exactly the kind of meticulous, flawless execution she'd once brought to the Cole family's events now attached entirely to her own name, drawing an increasingly prominent client list across Atlanta's competitive luxury events market. She spoke to her mother and sister only sparingly during those months, brief, carefully bounded conversations that never once addressed what had actually happened that particular evening. A silence Odessa maintained deliberately, understanding, with a clarity that had taken considerable time, and no small amount of therapy to fully develop, that continuing to seek acknowledgement from people who had already demonstrated their answer wasn't a healthy use of her own limited emotional energy. "I stopped waiting for them to finally see me clearly," Odessa said, in a conversation she'd later give permission to share as part of this story. "I decided somewhere in those first difficult months after that party that I was going to build a life so genuinely, undeniably mine that it would never again depend on whether my own mother or sister were willing to acknowledge me in public." Julian Cole, in the weeks immediately following that particular gala, found himself unable to fully shake a persistent, uncomfortable feeling about the specific way that evening had ended, a discomfort that only deepened once his own event coordinator, reviewing the evening's staffing records for an unrelated billing matter, mentioned, almost in passing, exactly who had actually been responsible for the flawless execution of that particular gala. That was Odessa Marchand's work, the coordinator told him, several weeks after the event, entirely unaware of the specific significance that name suddenly carried for Julian. "She's been running our events for years. Genuinely one of the best in the business. Shame she left the agency recently, actually. We haven't found anyone quite as good since." Julian sat with that information for a long moment, pieces of that chaotic, confusing evening finally beginning to click into place with a clarity he hadn't managed in the moment itself. The waitress who had apparently prevented some kind of accident on his dance floor. The 2 women who had denied knowing her, the specific, practiced grace Vanessa had displayed during their dance, grace that made considerably more sense now, understanding that the woman he'd ordered removed from his own party had very likely been the one who taught her those exact steps only minutes earlier. He began over the following weeks, a careful, deliberate effort to track down more information about exactly what had actually happened that evening, speaking directly with several members of his own household and event staff who had witnessed the incident firsthand, piecing together, gradually, a considerably more complete and troubling picture than the one he'd acted on so quickly that night. "I made a decision in about 10 seconds that I've spent months regretting," Julian later admitted. In comments he shared once he'd finally tracked down the full context of what had actually occurred. "I deferred to 2 women's confident denial without ever stopping to ask a single genuine question about who I might actually be removing from my own home." Julian located Odessa's new company, Marchand Events, roughly 4 months after that gala, discovering, with a considerable mixture of admiration and renewed guilt, exactly how successfully she'd built an independent business in the time since he'd ordered her dragged out of his own ballroom. He reached out directly, requesting a meeting, an invitation Odessa initially considered declining entirely, having built, over those 4 months, a genuine, hard-won peace that she wasn't particularly eager to disrupt by revisiting one of the most painful nights of her entire life. She agreed eventually to a brief meeting, curious despite herself, and perhaps still carrying some small, cautious hope that genuine accountability might actually be possible from at least one person connected to that devastating evening. I owe you an apology considerably more thorough than anything I can properly deliver in a single conversation, Julian told her, meeting her at her own modest but growing office space, a deliberate choice on his part to meet her on her own territory rather than requesting she come to him. I made a decision that night based on nothing but two people's confident denial, without asking a single real question about who you actually were or what you'd just done. I've since learned that you built the entire event I hosted that evening. I've learned you very likely prevented a serious injury to your own sister. And I ordered you removed like you were nothing, in front of 200 people, because two women I'd never met before that night sounded more certain than the truth actually was. Odessa listened to that apology with a measured, careful composure, appreciating its genuine specificity, while still holding, understandably, a cautious distance she wasn't yet ready to fully set aside. Julian's genuine accountability, delivered with considerably more specificity and humility than Odessa had necessarily expected, opened a cautious, gradually developing professional relationship between them over the following months. Julian's own family eventually becoming one of Marchand Events' most significant and loyal clients. A business relationship built now on genuine, informed respect rather than the anonymous, unseen labor Odessa had provided throughout her earlier years at Ashford Event Collective. Their relationship evolved, over roughly a year, from that careful professional foundation into something considerably more personal. A development neither of them rushed, both of them understanding, given everything that had led to their actual introduction, exactly how important a foundation of genuine trust and demonstrated respect would need to be before either of them was ready for anything more. Denise and Vanessa, upon learning of Julian's growing relationship with Odessa, attempted several times to re-establish contact, offers of reconciliation that Odessa approached with considerable, hard-earned caution, extending only the kind of measured, carefully bounded engagement that reflected everything she'd learned about her own worth in the years since that devastating gala. I don't need them to fully understand what they did that night for me to have made my own peace with it, Odessa said, in a conversation addressing the aftermath of everything that had unfolded. I needed, more than their apology, to build a life substantial enough that their denial that evening could never again define my own sense of worth. I got there. Everything that came afterward, including Julian's own accountability, was simply confirmation of something I'd already decided for myself in that parking lot the night they dragged me out. Vanessa, notably, made the most sustained effort of the two toward genuine repair, reaching out roughly 6 months after the gala with a letter that Odessa found, upon reading it, considerably more thoughtful and specific than she'd expected. Vanessa acknowledged, in that letter, not simply the specific cruelty of denying Odessa in front of the crowd, but the broader pattern of a lifetime spent accepting Odessa's quiet contributions without ever once publicly crediting them. I don't expect you to forgive me because I've finally said this out loud, Vanessa wrote. I just needed you to know that I've been sitting with exactly what I did, and exactly what it revealed about the kind of sister I'd been to you for our entire lives, not just that one night. Odessa didn't respond immediately, taking several weeks to consider the letter's sincerity, before eventually agreeing to a single careful conversation with Vanessa alone, a conversation that became the beginning of a slow, still cautious rebuilding between the two sisters, separate entirely from Odessa's continued distance from their mother. 2 years removed from that gala, Odessa Marchand runs one of Atlanta's most sought-after luxury event planning companies, her own name now carrying exactly the kind of professional recognition and respect she'd spent 6 earlier years quietly building for someone else's agency instead. She maintains a relationship with Julian built, deliberately and carefully, on the kind of genuine mutual respect that had been entirely absent from the chaotic, painful circumstances of their actual first meeting, a relationship both of them describe, when asked, as considerably stronger for having been built slowly, with full accountability, rather than rushed forward on the strength of one dramatic gala evening alone. Her relationship with her mother and sister remains, by Odessa's own deliberate choice, considerably more distant than it once was, though not entirely severed, occasional, carefully bounded contact rather than the desperate, hopeful closeness she'd spent decades chasing before that particular evening finally, painfully clarified exactly how one-sided that pursuit had always actually been. I think about that night at the party less than people probably expect me to, Odessa said, in one of her rare public comments addressing the story that had, by that point, become somewhat well known within Atlanta's social and business circles. What I actually think about is the 15 minutes I spent in that hallway, teaching my sister to dance, wanting so badly to finally feel like I belonged to my own family. I gave that moment everything I had. It just took me a while afterward to understand that belonging was never something I needed to earn from people who had already decided, a long time before that party, exactly how much of me they were willing to see.
Thanks for tuning in and watching to the end. Drop your comments below.